Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're literally stripping away centuries of Gothic fiction and those Hollywood vampire myths to reveal the intense, ultra-violent, and honestly incredibly fascinating history of a 15th century warlord. We are looking at Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. The real man wasn't some supernatural monster lurking in a dark castle. He was a leader forged in a crucible of constant war, brutal betrayal, and extreme geopolitical trauma. Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture this for a second. It's the year 1462. A massive Ottoman army, this seemingly unstoppable force, is marching directly toward the Wallachia capital. But suddenly, the Sultan orders his entire army to halt, because in front of them isn't a traditional army, but a sprawling, macabre forest. Over 20,000 Ottoman soldiers and sympathizers have been impaled on wooden stakes, just left in the blazing sun as a horrifying warning. This single, terrifying historical anecdote shocked an invading empire so deeply that the Sultan actually turned his army around. But to understand how a ruler gets to this point of extreme, calculated cruelty, we really have to look at the brutal world that created him. Section 1. The Buffer State Bloodbath, 15th Century Geopolitics. Now, what's really interesting about the situation here is that to understand Vlad's extreme violence, we've got to look at the brutal geographic reality he was born into. This absolutely wasn't a time or place for peaceful diplomacy. Consider the totally impossible situation of his homeland, Wallachia. It was caught squarely in the middle of a massive power struggle. On one side, you have the Ottoman Empire, right? A rising Islamic superpower determined to expand northwest into Europe, having already completely crippled the Byzantine Empire. On the other side, you've got the Kingdom of Hungary, this heavily militarized Christian defender desperate to protect its borders. And caught right in the crossfire, the buffer states. For the rulers of Wallachia, this wasn't about glorious conquest. It was about sheer, desperate survival. The local nobles, the boyars, were just constantly switching sides to stay alive. So this intense religious and political war actually defined Vlad's family identity right from the get-go. In 1431, the very year Vlad was likely born, his father was inducted into a prestigious chivalric group called the Order of the Dragon. Because of this, his father earned the moniker Dracula, which meant dragon. Consequently, his sons inherited the name Dracula, literally meaning son of the dragon. So you see, it was a title of Christian knightly honor. It's a far, far cry from the modern association with supernatural evil. Moving right along to Section 2, Hostages of the Empire, the Psychology of Pledges. And this brilliantly illustrates the crazy dynamics of the time. In the brutal geopolitics of the 15th century, alliances were incredibly fragile, and loyalty had to be ruthlessly enforced. To make absolutely sure Vlad's father wouldn't betray the Ottoman Sultan, young Vlad and his brother Radu were surrendered to the Ottoman court as hostages, or pledges. Placed in the exact same traumatic environment, the two captive brothers actually took completely divergent paths. Radu embraced his captors. He converted to Islam, integrated completely into Ottoman culture, and even joined the Sultan's elite Janissary Guard, becoming a really close companion to the future Sultan Mehmed II. Vlad, however, he fiercely resisted. The imprisonment fueled a deep, burning hatred for the Ottomans, and he used his time not to assimilate, but to intensely study his captors, with the explicit, obsessive goal of one day destroying them. But here's the wild part. Despite his fierce resistance, Vlad actually received an intense, high-level aristocratic education while being held by the Ottomans. He became completely fluent in Turkish and Persian. He studied logic and the Quran, and he totally mastered combat and horseback riding. But perhaps the most darkly ironic part of his entire education was his exposure to the Ottoman penal system. It was here, as a captive youth, that he likely first observed extreme punishments, including impalement. The Turks were essentially training the very man who would later use their own terror tactics against them, and with devastating effectiveness. That brings us to Section 3, Rise of the Impaler, the Game of Voivodes. So let's look at how he actually gets to power. Vlad's eventual freedom came at a horrific cost. In 1447, during this deeply turbulent game of voivodes, basically local warlords, his father and older brother were brutally assassinated by Hungarian forces working alongside traitorous local Wallachian nobles. A rival named Vladislav II took over, and this just kicked off a totally chaotic revolving door of power in Wallachia. In 1448, Vlad actually used Ottoman support, ironically provided by his former captors, to briefly seize the throne, but he got ousted just months later. It took nearly a decade in exile, navigating treacherous alliances and slowly building his own forces before Vlad finally got his revenge. In 1456, he met Vladislav II on the battlefield and killed him in hand-to-hand combat, officially becoming the undisputed ruler of Wallachia. Once he's finally in power, Vlad realizes he needs to establish absolute, unquestioned control over a state that was completely riddled with treason. He did this through a zero-tolerance policy on crime, enforced by the horrifying Spike. He systematically purged the treacherous boyars, impaling them and leaving their bodies out on public display to make a very gruesome point. To understand the atmosphere of absolute dread he maintained, you have to hear this legendary anecdote about the Golden Cup. Vlad supposedly placed a magnificent, solid gold goblet right in the center of his capital's town square. Anyone could drink from it, but under pain of agonizing death, it could never, ever leave the square. In a city of roughly 60,000 people, the cup was never stolen, not once. The fear of Vlad's wrath was simply that total. Section 4. The Guerrilla Warlord. Asymmetric Warfare. So, the crucial point is that this iron-fisted domestic control was very soon tested by outside forces. In 1462, when Ottoman envoys arrived at his court demanding tribute and submission, they refused to remove their turbans, citing their customs. Vlad responded by having those turbans literally nailed to their heads. This brazen, absolutely wild act of defiance sparked a massive military response. Sultan Mehmed II marched on Wallachia with an army estimated to be up to 300,000 strong. We're talking a massive, highly organized war machine. Vlad, even after recruiting literally anyone he could, teenagers, farmers, the impoverished, could only muster a poorly equipped force of about 30,000. He couldn't possibly win a pitched battle against such overwhelming odds. He had to change the rules of the game entirely. Faced with total annihilation, Vlad resorted to extreme, truly desperate measures. This was calculated asymmetric warfare designed to completely break an invader's spirit. First, he used a scorched earth strategy. He evacuated his people, burned all the crops, and deliberately poisoned the water supplies with animal corpses just to starve the advancing Turks. Second, in what is basically a shocking early use of biological warfare, he sent citizens suffering from lethal, highly contagious diseases, like the bubonic plague and leprosy, directly into the Ottoman camps to spread infection. And third, he utilized relentless psychological terror, continuously harassing this massive army with night raids and, of course, mass impalements. And all this psychological warfare culminated in the legendary night attack on Targovish Day. Utilizing the utter fluency in Turkish that he had learned during his agonizing years as a hostage, Vlad brilliantly disguised himself and infiltrated the Ottoman camp. He personally scouted the layout, located the Sultan's tent, and later that very night led a targeted, violently clandestine raid aiming to assassinate Sultan Mehmed himself. Now, while they accidentally breached the wrong tent and actually missed the Sultan, the raid caused massive, bloody chaos, slaying thousands of confused Ottoman soldiers in the dark. It was a spectacular display of guerrilla tactics that deeply, deeply shook the invading forces and proved Vlad's terrifying tactical genius. Let's wrap things up with Section 5. The man behind the myth. Legacy and legends. So, despite these incredible tactical feats, Vlad was ultimately a victim of the exact same geopolitics that forged him in the first place. Forced to flee Wallachia, he actually sought aid from his Christian ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. But instead of help, Corvinus betrayed him, throwing him into a Hungarian prison for over a decade. He would briefly return to power in 1476, but his reign was cut short. And to this day, the exact circumstances of his demise remain a massive subject of historical debate. Some accounts suggest he was slain in a final bloody battle against the Turks, while others claim he was assassinated by his own treacherous boyars or even killed in a hunting accident. The most accepted story is that he fell to the Ottomans, who severed his head, preserved it in honey, and actually sent it to Istanbul as absolute proof that the Impaler was finally dead. But his corpse, it was never definitively found, a mystery that really only fueled the centuries of legend that followed. Let's move to the legacy and see how this builds. How exactly did this warlord become the cultural phenomenon we know today? Well, Bram Stoker's 1897 creation borrowed the name Dracula and some vague geography, sure, but the suave, supernatural vampire is pure Gothic fiction. The historical Vlad was something far more grounded and, honestly, in many ways, far more terrifying. He was a highly calculated warlord. He wasn't a monster born of the supernatural, but a deeply human product of an ultra-violent 15th century culture. He was ruling a desperate buffer state where extreme terror was seen as a legitimate, even absolutely necessary, tool of statecraft. History rarely gives us simple villains or flawless heroes, does it? Especially not in the blood-soaked borderlands of the 15th century Balkans. To his enemies and to the merchants who wrote the early sensational pamphlets about him, he was an absolute embodiment of sadistic evil. But to those who saw him as the very last line of defense against an invading empire, he was a necessary, albeit terrifying, protector. Looking at all the evidence and the truly brutal world that shaped him, we want to leave you with this to consider. Was Vlad the Impaler a grim hero pushed to the absolute edge by the horrors of his era, or was he simply a bloodthirsty madman who enjoyed the terror he wrought? Think on that, and we'll see you in the next explainer.